This isn't a tapestry. It's 68 meters of stitched linen showing how England was taken in 1066. A crown dispute, a conquest, told in wool thread by people close enough to remember it. This is the story of how medieval makers turned embroidery into historical argument, and how the Bayeux Tapestry became one of the closest near-contemporary visual sources for the Norman conquest. This is no history. I used to think the Bayeux Tapestry was just a famous medieval wall hanging, but once I started with the object itself, the question stopped being, what does it show? The better question became, how is this thing making its case? Because this strip doesn't just show the Norman conquest. It shows how medieval people wanted that conquest to be understood. So start with the simplest correction. The Bayeux Tapestry is not woven like a true tapestry. A woven tapestry creates its image on the loom itself. The Bayeux work does something else entirely. Its makers took a linen ground and stitched colored wool yarn onto it. That also means image and support were separate stages of work. The cloth could be planned, measured, and even joined before the storytelling was finished. Those technical names matter. Stem stitch gives the figures their sharp lines. Laid and couched work fills cloaks, sails, shields, and animal bodies with broad blocks of color. That difference sounds minor, but it changes labor, planning, and revision. A workshop can prepare a long linen strip, draw figures, add captions, and then stitch over the plan. That means the Bayeux Tapestry could be organized like a visual script. It could also be divided among multiple hands without losing the overall sequence. The surviving embroidery is about 68.3 meters long and roughly half a meter high. Popular summaries round that to nearly 70 meters by 50 centimeters. Either way, it is enormous. And scale matters, because the object strongly guides both your gaze and your movement. You don't stand back and absorb it in a glance. You walk beside it. You read it in motion. The format encourages viewers to experience the story sequentially, step by step, as they move alongside it. That physical experience is part of the source. Before we ever reach Hastings, the Bayeux Tapestry has already taught us how it wants to be watched. And that method is more sophisticated than it first appears. The story begins before swords collide. That matters because the central issue is legitimacy, not just violence. Edward the Confessor died on the 5th of January, 1066. Soon after, Harold Godwinson was chosen and crowned King of England. The Bayeux Tapestry puts those moments in sequence, because sequence makes an argument. First comes the dying king, then the funeral, then the coronation. The order nudges you toward a conclusion about who moved too quickly and who might claim to have been wronged. Who follows Edward the Confessor? A single image could only hint at that fight. A strip almost 70 meters long can build it step by step. Repeated figures help you track Harold Godwinson across the story. Buildings mark changes of place. The captions are in Latin. That alone tells you this was meant to sound authoritative. Latin was the language of record, liturgy, and elite communication across much of medieval Western Europe. But some spelling habits and forms feel closer to an English workshop environment than a Norman French one. Even gestures do narrative work. A hand can direct your eye. A seated ruler can announce authority. A crowd looking upward can turn the sky into commentary. That is exactly what happens when Halley's comet appeared and was treated in sources as a portent. The Bayeux Tapestry includes a scene usually identified as this comet. The comet is not there for astronomy. It is there to load the story with consequence. Then there are the borders. At first, they look decorative, but they often echo, intensify, or darken the main action. Sometimes they work almost like a second voice under the main narration. In quieter scenes, the borders can feel playful. As violence grows, the borders grow harsher too. So the Bayeux Tapestry doesn't just display events, it edits them. That brings us to the second common mistake. Because the embroidery supports William, Duke of Normandy, many people assume it must have been made in Normandy. I assumed that too. But the material and visual evidence point more carefully than that. Most specialists think it was made in England, probably in the 1070s. First, the inscriptions are Latin, but their spelling habits and letter forms lean toward an English context. That doesn't give us absolute certainty, but it does give us direction. Second, the stitching methods fit English embroidery traditions. Those are not random craft choices. They are workshop fingerprints. A large embroidery also needs trained coordination. The same methods had to stay legible from one section to the next across tens of meters of cloth. Third, the figures resemble late Anglo-Saxon manuscript art. The long bodies, energetic outlines, and compressed little buildings all point in that direction. What historians look for is convergence, and here the language, the stitches, and the artistic style converge on England. That creates a remarkable irony. One of the most famous visual celebrations of William the Conqueror may have been made by English hands under Norman rule. That possibility matters historically. It suggests that after 1066, power in England did not just seize land. It redirected skilled labor, memory, and storytelling. There is also the patron question. A common candidate is Odo, Bishop of Bayeux and William's half-brother, because he appears prominently and had the resources to commission something this ambitious. He also had a reason to shape the memory of the invasion in a way that favored the new regime. But that remains a strong hypothesis, not a settled fact. That caution matters, because conquest is not only about who wins the field, it is also about who gets to commission the memory. So what kind of source is this exactly? Not a neutral window. A medieval documentary with a patron, a sequence, and a point of view. That means we read it the same way historians read any powerful source. What does it show clearly? What does it emphasize? And what does it leave frustratingly vague? Read it that way, and the Bayeux Tapestry becomes astonishingly rich. It preserves clothing, shields, ship design, church architecture, weapons, feasting, and gesture. Some details are stylized, but many are precious because so few visual sources survive from this exact political world. Take the ships. We see timber cut, we see hulls prepared, we see horses led aboard, we see shields hung along the sides, we see troops cross the channel. That is not just battle memory, it is campaign planning in pictures. And that point is easy to miss if we rush to the fighting. An invasion army did not simply appear on an English beach. It needed transport animals, timber, sail power, coordination, and enough elite control to move men and supplies together. The embroidery gives us exactly those steps. That makes the object valuable, not only for who fought, but for how conquest functioned. The embroidery even slows down for preparation. Men unload equipment, food is prepared. Leaders confer over the next move. That sequence matters for another reason too. It gives William, Duke of Normandy, the look of a commander who plans, feeds, and organizes before he strikes. In other words, the embroidery builds legitimacy through competence as much as through victory. That matters because it reminds us that conquest runs on logistics before it runs on glory. Then the timeline tightens. Harold defeated a Norwegian-led invasion at Stamford Bridge on the 25th of September, 1066. 3 days later, William landed in Sussex on the 28th of September. That gap matters. Harold Godwinson had just fought one major campaign in the north when a second threat arrived from across the Channel.
That forced Harold into a brutal movement south after a major northern victory. The Bayeux Tapestry does not spell out every calculation, but it gives the campaign momentum. By the time we reach Hastings, the embroidery has already built pressure through death, coronation, omen, transport, and movement. Then comes the battle. Norman cavalry drive uphill. The English shield wall holds, then fractures. Axes rise, horses fall, bodies accumulate in the borders and beneath the fight. The rhythm changes here. Earlier scenes breathe. Battle scenes crowd the eye. That compression is doing historical work.
It makes Conquest feel overwhelming, fast and costly, even while the larger argument still favors William. The Bayeux Tapestry does something powerful here. It keeps names near leaders, but lets confusion swallow the rest. That is not a flaw in the source. It is part of the message. And this is where it finally clicked for me. The Bayeux Tapestry works less like a static artwork and more like a scripted argument made in thread. Not a tapestry, not a neutral record, a linen chronicle of conquest. Suddenly, the form explains the force of the message. Embroidery gives you line, caption, repetition, and movement across distance. It also gives you selection. And selection is where power hides. That is why the omissions matter. The ending is missing. So the surviving object stops before it can fully show how the new order wished to conclude the story. The exact patron is still uncertain. One scene is usually read as Harold Godwinson's death, but scholars still debate exactly which figure is Harold. That debate matters because even the death of Harold II is being shaped by composition. If the identity is uncertain, then the image is doing what powerful images often do. It may preserve the emotional force of a king's fall more clearly than the exact forensic details. So even one of the most famous images in medieval history contains argument, damage, and ambiguity. That doesn't weaken the source. It teaches us how to use it. Looking back, this Bayeux Tapestry reminds us that power survives not only in crowns and battlefields, but in the stories a society manages to stitch into memory. But the next mystery is who ordered this linen chronicle to be made at all, and why its makers chose to leave England's future hanging in thread. We follow the evidence where it goes, starting with the object itself, the language around it, and the details historians can actually test. In one phrase, tell me which part of the Bayeux Tapestry feels most revealing: the embroidery itself, or the story it tells about Harold Godwinson and William, Duke of Normandy. And with that final stitch, the conquest is still speaking.